So let's talk about the evolution of this subject, which is very, very important to know that how human resource management has evolved over a period of time, what exactly it is. So as we know that human resource management is all about people. So it's more about how do you manage your human resources. So how human, earlier human were not treated as resources also. So that's the reason why this evolution becomes really important. So basically, human resource management is the management of the organization's workforce or human resources. So as I told you that earlier, when this concept came, earlier this concept was not there, like human resource management was not there. So we used to have personal management. And we'll talk about that also in today's session. But initially, it was all about how do you manage your workforce? How do you try to use them as a resource? Because this is one of those resources which cannot be copied, right? A Google can have an ex-employee who can be very, very valuable employee, but the same person cannot be hired. You can hire the same person, like you can headhunt that person from one company to another company, but if you'll try to find a very similar kind of person, it's very difficult because humans can't be copied. It's not like a technology which can be copied, right? So that's why the first thing we need to understand is that human resource management is all about managing your workforce. Workforce means the people who are working in the organization, right? That's the first thing. Moving on, so it is responsible for what do exactly human resource management do? So they are responsible for attracting talent. So when I say attracting talent means that whenever I publish a job, I believe that a lot of people should be attracted and should apply to my company. That's the first role of any human resource manager, that you need to attract talent so that more and more people can apply. If my company is so unknown, if my company is not well known to people, a lot of people may not be get exciting with your job role, right? They might not be interested in your role, right? So the first thing is to attract more and more talent to your organization. Second important thing, which is very, very important, is the selection part. So once you have attracted more and more people, the second thing which human resource management do, that they select people out of those pool. So let's say 100 people applied for a particular job, then I will shortlist few people, and then I will conduct a lot of rounds of interviews maybe, and then I might shortlist 5 people or 6 people who are suiting the best for my organization. So the first thing you need to do, you need to attract the talent. The second thing you need to do is to select the best out of those pool, out of those talent, and then training them. Because when anybody joins in any organization, it is very, very important that whether they are well trained or not. And most of the organizations work in a different way. They don't work on a standard process. So that's why they might be using different softwares, they might be using different processes, they might be using different work culture. So that's the reason why training becomes a very crucial element of human resource. You need to train people about the job role, you need to train them about the culture, you need to train about the communication, you need to train them about the structure, you need to train them in every aspect which is possible. So that is the reason why training becomes really important, right? So, and then after this, once they are trained and they started working with you, then assessment becomes important. So maybe after 6 months, maybe quarterly, maybe yearly, maybe after 6 months, you need to assess them that how they are performing. That's very, very important, that you need to understand how well they are performing. Because based on that only you are going to reward them, or you are going to provide them any kind of feedback, right? Let's say somebody is doing really a good job, you will provide them promotions, you will provide them salary, you can provide them a number of benefits. On the other side, there is a possibility that the organization is not doing that well, the people is not doing that well, the organization is not working. So that is the reason why it is very, very important that uh, we should assess people, right? So assess and then reward. Very simple. Assess them and either reward them or provide them feedback. Very, very important. Feedback is the key, right? How you will improve somebody's performance by providing them feedback, right? So you need to attract people, you need to select few people, you need to train them, you need to assess them, and then you need to reward them. while also overseeing the organizational leadership and culture and ensuring that compliance with the employment and labor laws. So let me talk about all these words so that you understand what exactly the meaning here is. That every organization has a different culture, right? Their culture could be very centric culture. Their culture could be a different kind of culture. Might be they're not very centric. They're like fragmented industry. They work in a fragmented industry. They're not very competitive. Their culture could be very competitive. There could be not be very competitive. The culture could be very formal. The culture could not be very formal. So depending upon that, the human resource also, when they hire new people, they always look into this perspective, that whether this new employee will be suiting to our culture or not. That's very important, right? So they must be suiting to the culture. And after that, that's another important point, is ensuring the compliance of employment and labor laws. Now this is important. Why I say? Because whenever you operate in a particular country, for example, let's say there is a company who is operating in Canada. It's a global company. Let's say the company is headquartered at US, but it is working in Canada. Or it's an Indian company working in Canada, right? So in that situation, they have to follow the laws of this country. They cannot work without following the law. The law is supreme. So that's the reason why there are certain employment laws. There are certain labor laws. For example, if anybody is offering anyone a job in Canada, they have to pay the minimum wages, which has been decided by a particular province. Very simple. So whatever the rate is today, let's the rate is 15.5 or it could be 16, whatever the rate is, you cannot hire people legally. I'm talking about legally. I'm not talking about illegally. I'm talking about legally. You cannot hire someone without paying that much amount because the government has specified that law. So you need to understand whatever you are doing, you need to understand the culture, you need to understand the labor laws of a particular country, you need to understand the leadership of a particular organization, right? So I hope the first 2 points which we talked about is clear now. Okay. So moving on, in circumstances where employer desire and are legally authorized to hold a collective bargaining agreement, HR will also serve as company's primarily liaison between the employer representative, usually labor union, right? So what happens is that whenever an organization is a big organization, let's say, and there are big organization means there are more than 500 employees working in an organization, right? So they might have certain issues time to time, for example, with related to work process, with related to their salary, with related to anything, right? And that is the reason why it is very very important that you need to have a union. You need to have a communication process through which uh, you have to be very very sure. You have to be very very sure uh, that you are very very clear about that particular idea, that okay, there is a union which talks about the welfare of the employees, right? So it is very important that you talk about the welfare of the employees, right? So what are the various things which we need to think about as a human resource management? We need to attract people, we need to select people, we need to train them, we need to assess them, we need to reward them, we need to understand our culture, we need to understand the labor laws, we need to understand that there should be a communication process also, which is also called as the grievance handling process. So grievance handling process means whenever a certain employee faces any issue, how they will going to talk with management, how they are going to discuss it with management. So that's the reason why it is very very important that you discuss it, right? So that's very very important. So let's move out that HR is the product of human relation movement in the earlier 20th century. So this whole concept of human resources has started from 20th century when the researcher began documenting ways of creating business value through strategic management of the workforce, right? So the whole concept was more about just make sure that people are working and they are providing you the output which is required. We never thought of in this way that your workforce should be happy, they should be satisfied, they should be motivated. We never thought about these things. We only thought about in this way that we are only focusing on this part, that they should be working only for the efficiency of the organization. Later on, in the 20th century, when the researchers started documenting that, okay, the business value can only be generating when build strategy around workforce. So you have to come up with ideas that, okay, uh, how our workforce can be more efficient, how they can be more committed, so how more they are working in a way that they're working towards organization goals. That's really, really important. And that is the reason why that the whole thing transformed in 20th century. The function was initially dominated by the transactional work. As I told you that earlier, it was more like transaction, that, okay, we are paying you, you are working in the organization, do your work and go back, right? It was more about just a payroll system. The role of HR was just to provide salary to the people. That's it. Very simple. Benefit administration, little bit here and there, and more about, mainly about payroll, right? But due to globalization, due to companies consolidation, technology advancement, and there are a lot of other things which happened, and that's the reason why HR role was the scope. It was not just limited to uh, providing salaries. The role completely got transformed by acquiring the right talent, succession planning, grievance handling, finding the right talent for the people, human resource planning, managing compensation. So it came with a lot of other things which was added to this. So if I say that earlier in the 19th century, your scope was like this, very small scope, only about focusing on payroll, and then your scope was like this. Your scope was a little bigger scope, because then you talent acquisition, then you have payroll management, then you have your training, you have compensation, you have handling leadership, you a lot of other things, there are a lot of small boxes which are out there in this particular role. That as the role has completely transformed. And we'll also talk about today, in today's sessions, we'll also talk about that role of the human resource management. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution part, that how this has evolved. This is very, very important, right? The history of personal management begins because earlier I told you that before human resource management, there was a concept of personal management. This was the concept, right? So, what was this personal management? I'll talk about the comparison between the two also, right? So, but let me talk about that before, right now, just note this point, that before human resource management, it was more about personal management, okay? The history of personal management begins around the idea of end of 19th century. I told you it was earlier started 19th century when the personal management came into picture. When the welfare officers, some were also called as welfare secretaries, they came into being. So earlier it was not HR officers, or it was not about human resource managers. It was more about welfare officers. So they were more like, they were known. The designation was known as welfare officers, or they were known as welfare secretaries. They were women and concerned only with the protection of women and girls. So mainly these these secretaries were mainly women, and they were more concerned only about the women protection and the girls protection working in a workplace. The reason here was that at that time it was the women community or the girls community, they used to be getting more exploited at workplace. So that's the reason why these girl communities, these workforce, female workforce, they combined together, and they tried to form their own group, and that's why there were only welfare officers who were concerned about their rights, right? Their creation was the reaction of the harshness of the industrial condition. I told you that there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot of harshness in the working conditions in those industrial revolution time, right? So that's the reason why, that's what it was required, that was need of the hour that time, right? And with the pressures arising from the extension of the franchisee, the influence of the trade union and the labor movement, then the comparing of the enlightened employer. So there are a lot of things which happened in that phase, right? The first thing that happened is that a lot of labor movements came in. When the laborers were exploited, they started raising their voice. So a lot of labor movement that began. Apart from that, there was a huge influence of trade unions. So there was already few registered trade unions, so they also starting a lot of putting pressure that there should be a proper HR officer, a proper welfare officer should be there in the organization. And the third thing that happened over there is even the organizations, they also got enlightened up at that particular time that if we want to sustain for a longer period of time, if we want to make sure that we are providing the right environment for the people to work, it is very important that we should have welfare officers. So these are the following reasons for because of which this whole concept of welfare officer came in. As the role grew, there was some tension between the aim of moral protection of the women, of the children, and the needs of the higher output. Now, this was bound to happen, right? Why this was bound to happen? Let me talk about that point now. So earlier, when we were mainly focused about the welfare of the people, organizations said, okay, it's fine, that okay, welfare is good. And we also want to provide the right environment for the people, right? But then they obviously when you will fight for certain rights, the output is going to come down, right? Because when you say that I'll only work 8 hours, let's say, then earlier, let's say you were working 12 hours. As per welfare, you are working now 8 hours. That means there is a gap of 4 hours. That means that output will differ, right? Earlier, if you were producing 100 units, now you will only produce 70 units. And this was a compromising point because management was not ready for it. Management was not ready for any kind of compromise that is going to happen. That's very, very important. So it is the role of the HR manager that or at that particular time to create a balance, but the balance was not so easy because whenever the output goes low, the management was very, very adamant. The management was not at all supportive that okay, we are happy to provide welfare, because their only concern was that we are ready for the welfare, but the output should not come down, right? So it is very important. Then the First World War came in, right? So let's talk about the phase of First World War. What happened in First World War? The First World War accelerated change in the development of personal management. So obviously, the First World War was a tough time for the whole world, and that's where the role of personal management started flourishing, right? The role got expanded, with the women being recruited in the large number to fill the gap left by men going to fight. So what happened when the fight began? Now this is important and a very interesting concept. So when the fight started, when the war started, earlier only army people were fighting, or the military forces were fighting. But later on, the civilians were also included in the warfare because that was the need of the hour. But whatever they were doing as civilians, those positions were vacant. So when those positions were vacant, that was filled by women working in the different working women who were mostly at home. So that's the reason why a lot of women they became the part of the workforce who were earlier only a homemaker. They became a part of the workforce, which in turn meant reaching agreement with the trade unions, offer with the bitter disputes. So what happened that when they joined, they talked about their own welfare, and then they need to, because trade union also bargaining power came down because they had to include women. There were no choice. So they also compromised by saying that okay, we are ready to provide you the welfare, we are ready to provide you the best of the opportunities, but we have to be very, very sure that you should be part of the workforce right now. That is what was required. A lot of these women were even unskilled because they never worked. They were only at home, they never worked. So that was the reason why that they have to dilute their quality standards also, and the craftsman job, and there are very other, all the main man-made work which came to a halt was filled by a woman who were trying to fought for their welfare. And even the trade union who were opposing earlier to support that welfare, they were ready to provide you because they never had other choice at that time, and the First World War, right? And then moving on, what happened in the period of 1920s after World War, what happened? So during the 1920s, job with the titles of labor manager or employment manager came into being in the engineering industry. So earlier evolution began from engineering industry, where you have a dedicated person who was called as labor manager, at times also called as employment manager. They became part of the organization. Other industry, which were mainly large factories, to handle absence, recruitment, dismissal, queries over bonus, and so on. So basically, uh, at that time also, that we were not talking about welfare, or we were they were mainly handling what are the various things they were doing at that time. They were only hiring recruitment, so they were trying to hire more people, and they used to provide them salaries. They tried to handle their queries. They also at times look into their dismissal. So somebody who's leaving the job, or if we are dismissing someone because of their bad conduct, or they're not following the code of conduct, so in that situation, that was early 20s, right? So early 20s were more about labor managers and employment managers. Employers Federation, particularly in the engineering and the shipbuilding, negotiated national pay rates with the union. But there were local and district variations. There were plenty in scope of disputes. Now, this is again an important point. So, what happened is, when there was a trade union, there was an employee federation, they started talking and negotiating with the pay rates. They said that let's decide a standard pay rate so that the employee should be also happy, the management should also be agreed on it, and we are good to go, right? They also agreed on it, right? They provided that, okay, let's go with these rates. But obviously there were so many local companies at working at different district levels. They always had the variation of pay, right? So even if the from the top level, there was a decision already made for this point, that okay, we will have a standard rate, but actually the standard rate was not given to everyone. There were certain companies at district level and local companies who were not providing that the same rate also. So this was all in 1920s. So what happened in 1930s now? So let's talk about that part. So during the 1930s, with the economy bringing up, picking up, big corporation in the new sector saw value in improving employee benefits and the way of recruiting, retaining, and motivating employees. And this was the same time that when human relationship approach came into management. This was the same time when Elton Mayo experiment, like Hawthorne experiment, and all that came into existence. And that is the reason why even like bigger corporations, they started realizing the potential of this particular role, that okay, it is not only just providing salary or just providing only hiring or dismissal. It is also about how do you retain people, how do you retain good people, because if somebody is good, they will, somebody is going, somebody else will always have an eye on it, and they will try to hire them. So you have to retain them also. The second important thing is by motivating employees, that how you can motivate employees, how you can understand that everybody's need is not same. So that's the reason why retaining and motivating became very, very important. Okay. But older industries, but this only happened in the engineering industry, right? This doesn't happen in the other industry. The older industries like textile, mining, and shipbuilding were hit by the worldwide recession. We all know that in 1929, 28, we had that Great Depression, right? And because of that, the industries like textile, mining, shipbuilding, they all got a hit, and they were not able, they were not in a position actually to adopt any of the new techniques which came in existence, seeing no need to do so because they had no difficulty in recruiting later labor. The problem was that since labor was easily available, people were ready to work in hard condition also. Nobody was talking about the welfare. Economic depression was so high that people didn't had any money in their hand, so they were agreed to work at whatever pay rate they were getting. So labor was not the problem. There was like a lot of people were, it was not a right time, it was not the right time to come up with some new technology or come up with anything, right? So the 1920s were more of when the employment officer and manager came into picture, and in 1930s it was more about how to motivate people, how to retain them. But still, due to depression, a lot of industry were hit back, and that's the reason why they were not able to hire more people, right? Or hire, provide that kind of benefits. Then the Second World War started, right? The Second World War came in 1940s. So what happened in the Second World War, right? So Second World War brought about welfare and personal work in the full-time basis at all. So then, in this particular time, the real personal work, the real personal management, they started came into existence, establishing, producing war material because an expanded Ministry of Labor and National Service insisted on it, just as the government has insisted on the welfare workers and the factories in the previous conflict. So this is very, very important now. What happened here is that Ministry of Labor, they said that, okay, uh, we need a lot of workers, right? We need, because there are a lot of warfare material that needs to be produced. But if we want people to produce, we can only convince them by providing them the right work culture, by providing them the right welfare. And that is the reason why a lot of things changed in Second World War. The government saw specialized personal management as a part of the driving and creating efficiency. So basically, before that, anybody was recruiting for this role. Anybody can work, right? Nobody was thinking in that way that, okay, there should be some specialized person for it. In this particular time, in this Second World War time, that what happened, that people started recruiting specialized people for this, those who had experience, those who understand the value of people, those who understand the welfare, those who understand the labor laws. So they were personalized people. Why? Because they wanted to increase their efficiency, they wanted to increase, make sure that uh, that people should be happy, people should be motivated to work, because then only the best of the output can come in. So that was very, very important. And that is the reason why, if you look at the numbers also, in 1943, it was around 5,300, right? But in 1945, what happened, that suddenly the number was increasing. So in 1945, employment management and the welfare work had become the integrated of the broader term called personal management. So basically, the concept of personal management that came into existence in 1940s. So here what happened, that people started like uh, like welfare became a part, integral part of the organization. Welfare became an integral part. Experience of the war had shown that the output and productivity could influence the employment policy. So what happened in war has clearly shown us that output and productivity is a lot of dependent on employment policy. So if you'll make employment policy very tough, very not at all flexible, then people will also revolt, they will also not contribute. But if you will provide them flexible working, provide them the right pay, you make the policies a little flexible for them, you believe that people will work, people will feel motivated, and they will be committed to your work. The role of the personal function at wartime had largely influenced the implementing the rules demanded by the large-scale state government production. So at that time, I told you already that a lot of production was related to warfare equipments, and that was the need of the hour at that time, and that's the reason why uh, it was quite clear that we need to produce. That's the only thing we are supposed to do. And that's the reason why uh, the whole structure at that time of the organization was more like a bureaucratic. Bureaucratic means that there is an administrator, and there is no rigid mass production is going on, no flexi system, very rigid rules. Everybody has to follow the discipline, everybody has to follow the hierarchy. So that was more about bureaucratic system. So that's the reason why at that time personal function was also was shaped by bureaucratic organization. Okay. Following the development of the poor industrial relation during the 1960s, Royal Commission under the Lord Derwent was set up. So what happened is the earlier personal management mainly focused on recruitment, talent acquisition, at times also training, and at times mainly focused on implementing the rules which was suggested by the state governments over that time. But later on they realized in 1960s that there should be some industrial relations also. Industrial relation means that if there is any problem, the trade union has to, we need to communicate, we need to talk with the trade union, we need to talk to the employees. That's really, really important. And that's the reason why the Royal Commission, which was under Lord Donovan, which was set up in 1960. Right? So we have covered 1920s, then 30s, then 40s. We talk about First World War, then 20s, 30s, 40s, and 60s. I hope it is clear. Okay, so moving on to the next thing. Then reporting in 1968, it was critical for both employer and union. Personnel manager were criticized for lacking negotiation skills and failing to plan industrial relation strategy. So before 1960s, personnel management people, they were not trained into negotiation. They were not trained for handling negotiations between unions and the management, and that is the reason why they were very very criticized, that these people doesn't have, because they will always talk one way, right? Either they are on the side of management, or either they are on the side of workforce, and at the end of the day, if you're on one side, the other side will always be unhappy with you. They will always criticize your role, and that is the reason why uh, they were highly criticized either by the workers or either by the management in 1968. At least in part, Donovan suggested that this deficiency was the consequence of management failure to give personal management sufficient high priority. And Donovan, in his committee, he said that this is happening because they were not trained enough, and this is also happening because the management is not able to explain them properly that what is their priority. It's very very important to make them sure that okay, this is your priority. You need to focus on this only. Okay, this is very important. So we have to be sure that what we are, how we are explaining it to the personal management. That is also very, very important. Okay. Okay. Moving on. In the 1960s and 70s. So what happened in 1960s and 70 now? In 1960s and 70, employment started to develop significantly. So what happened that after the war was over, people recovered from war, and suddenly you see a sudden increase in the employment market. A lot of companies started opening up, and that's the reason why uh, employment started generating, right? At the same time, personal techniques developed using theories from the social sciences about motivation and organizational behavior. So as I told you earlier, that a lot of motivation theory like Maslow theory, need-based theory, content-based theory, so a lot of theories that that peeped in the motivation segment, and that's the reason why that the personal management people, they also started following those theories just to make sure that people are motivated enough to work. That was really really important. And then moving on to the next thing, and that is that selection was started doing through testing. So earlier it was more about availability of people. So if it is you are available, you are hired. But later on they started testing people, that whether they are good enough or not. If they are good enough, then only we'll hire them, obviously, because it was the game of demand and supply also, right? Now the supply was increasing, so that's why the employer, it became more like an employer market, but they had a lot of chance, they had a lot of scope whom to hire and whom not to hire. Okay. And then management training also got expanded. So earlier the training was not the part of personal management. Nobody trained anyone. They started working, and then they failed, they made mistakes, and then they learned it, right? But in this particular period of 1960s and 70s, they started training people so that less mistakes should be there, and there should be less wastage of resources as well. During the 1970s, specialism started to develop with rewards and resourcing, for example, being addressed as a separate issue. So, work speciality also came into picture. So, work speciality was more focused on that. Okay, if I am doing good in particular thing, I will only be doing that thing, right? On the other side, earlier it was not like it. Role was more like uh, that the role was more like that. Okay, I'm a generic labor, I can do anything. You just give me the work, I'll do X also, I'll do Y also, I'll do Z also. But later on in this 70s period, what happened is people became more specialist. They said that okay, we are good at X, we'll only do X, but we are not good at Y, so I'll not be doing Y. I'm only good at Z, so I'll do Z, but I'm not good at X and Y, so I'll not be doing X and Y. So people became more specialized in the period of 1970s. The concept of work specialization came in this particular period. Then in the period of 1980s, what happened? The term human resource management arrived in USA. So earlier it was more about personal management, mainly focused on personal management, and later on they started focusing on suddenly this term came, which is called as the human resource management, and the transition began from personal management to the human resource management. The term human resource management is an interesting one. Why it is interesting? It is, seems to suggest that employees were an asset of the resource like machines. So earlier, as I told you, money, machine, they were considered as your real resource. Most of the companies, they used to say that these are our resources. We are investing into our resources. But when the concept of human resource management came in, then what happened that they said that, okay, don't need to worry. Human is also a resource. Treat them as resource. They are also assets, just like machine. But at the same time, HR also appear to be emphasizing more on employee commitment and motivation. As I told you that HRM is all about motivating people. HRM is all about that how you can bring out the best of any person in a particular role. And that is the reason why it is very, very important that you have committed people, you have self motivated people who work for the organization goal in the direction of organization vision, they fit into your culture. And that's the reason why the whole concept of personal management, which had a narrow scope only related to particular functions, the new term human resource management has a broader concept. It has a better approach of looking at things, and more importantly, uh, the role got expanded, and the more focus was on uh, commitment, the more focus was on motivation. It was very, very important.